Greetings, everyone. This short video presentation is going to introduce us to a couple of really important ideas in biology and one really important molecule. So, living things need energy. Energy to build their bodies, energy to do the work of being alive. And a lot of that work is just fighting against the physical universe that wants to tend to break things down into smaller, simpler pieces. And the energy that living things need comes from the chemical energy stored in the bonds of what we call food molecules. And there are lots of different kinds of food molecules that have energy that we can use. And almost all of those food molecules in almost all of the ecosystems on Earth originally got their energy from the sun. And a couple of key questions that we'll be thinking about as we discuss this. So we break down the living world into two categories depending on where they get their food. And those two categories are autotrophs and heterotrophs. Auto as a prefix means self, and hetero means other. Troph means food or feeding, so an autotroph is a self-feeding organism. Plants, as I'm sure you're aware, algae and some other organisms are able to capture energy from the light of the sun and use that to produce food by photosynthesis. So all the green plants and plant-like organisms out there are autotrophs. There are also some really interesting autotrophs living in other ecosystems, in cracks in the Earth's crust. There are bacteria that feed off of chemical compounds found in the rocks. And in the deep ocean ridges and trenches, there are interesting forms of life. And in these ecosystems that are far, far removed from any sunlight, the source of energy is again chemicals coming up from the Earth's crust. And there are some bacteria living in those ecosystems that can convert that chemical energy into food energy. And then they're the basis for all of the other energy transformations and energy transfers in the ecosystem. And so all of the other organisms that need to eat to acquire their food, we can't produce the food in our body like plants. We're the heterotrophs. And for autotrophs and for heterotrophs, a really important player in this energy transfer that all living things are involved with is a molecule called adenosine triphosphate. And we will call it ATP from now on. ATP is a molecule that is used as a ready and convenient source of energy for most of the functions that require energy inside of cells. So when a cell needs to do some work, requires some energy, most of the time ATP is the source of energy. The way ATP is used inside your cells, inside your body, is kind of the way we use electricity in our homes. So there are lots of different sources of energy for modern life. We can burn fossil fuels like coal and oil. We can use renewable sources like wind and solar. We can use the nuclear reactions that take place in radioactive substances. All of those can be used as a potential source of energy because they all have energy inherent in those substances that can be released. And most of our modern life runs on electricity, right? Your refrigerator runs on electricity. Our computers run on electricity. The television runs on electricity. washer and dryer run on electricity. And we have a fridge that has a plug, and to get that refrigerator to work, we got to plug it into a socket that has electric current. There's energy in a lump of coal. There's energy in oil or natural gas. There's energy in sunlight and in nuclear radioactive materials. But we can't plug our fridge into any of those. We need electricity. And very similarly in cells, ATP is like the electric current of the cell. There are other sources of energy, lots of other molecules in living things that have energy that could be used to do work in cells. But most of a cell's functioning runs on ATP. So we can take those other sources of energy and create ATP in the same way we take lots of different sources of energy to generate electricity at a power plant. And similarly, to have the way a power plant works, cells have organelles inside them that work like a power plant and convert these other forms of food energy into ATP energy. So ATP is a molecule that has a base, which is the opposite of an acid, on one side of the molecule, a sugar in the middle. The sugar is called ribose. And then it has 3 phosphate groups, in the case of ATP, attached to the sugar. A phosphate group is a phosphorus atom surrounded by 3 or 4 oxygen atoms. And ATP has 3 phosphates sticking off the end of the molecule. Phosphate groups are negatively charged, and so this ATP molecule has 3 negatively charged pieces bunched together at the end of the molecule. Now, we know that negative charges repel each other, so this part of the molecule where the phosphates are is quite unstable. And so ATP doesn't stay ATP forever. It can spontaneously decompose and lose a phosphate or 2. We can think about the functioning of ATP in cells sort of like a partially charged and a fully charged battery. When ATP has all 3 of its phosphate groups, it has more potential energy, and it's like a fully charged rechargeable battery. When ATP is used to provide energy, it almost always is by transferring the 3rd phosphate group to another substance. That's like giving it energy. And then ADP that is left after it loses a phosphate group, that ADP can be recharged by reattaching a phosphate group. And not surprisingly, we have enzymes that do that all the time in our cells. So that's how ATP works. By releasing the 3rd phosphate group, it sort of donates energy to whatever substance it's reacting with. And then when we want to make more ATP in our cells, we take the ADP that was left over and we add a 3rd phosphate group to regenerate ATP. So what does ATP do in cells? Well, almost everything that requires energy in a cell is powered by ATP. There are some other molecules and some other processes that don't require ATP or can use alternatives, but most of the functioning in cells is powered by ATP. So again, ATP combines with water, can be broken down into ADP and phosphate, and then the energy that was released in that process can be used to fuel these activities. And the PI, the little I, stands for inorganic, because when it's not attached to the ADP, then that phosphate is no longer part of an organic molecule. So that is a little abbreviation that scientists use to denote that this is an inorganic phosphate. It's an inorganic little piece of matter. Here's an example of how ATP can power a process. We need to make glutamine in our cells. That is an amino acid that we use to build our proteins with. And we make glutamine by attaching one molecule, glutamic acid, to another molecule, ammonia, and creating that new bond, creating this new substance, requires energy, about 3.4 kilocalories of energy for every mole of substance that's produced. The mole is the scientific unit for an amount of matter, and it's equal to a whole bunch of molecules of whatever substance we're talking about. So to make glutamine, we need energy. And so to get this reaction to happen, we need to add energy. And this is a very common way that energy is added to reactions like this. We start off by having ATP react with one of the reactant molecules, in this case, the glutamic acid. And ATP does what ATP does, and that is to donate a phosphate group. And what we have after this reaction is a glutamic acid with a phosphate now bonded to that molecule. That, in a sense, energizes that molecule. And then we have the ADP that's left over. Now it can go grab another phosphate from someplace else and be recharged as ATP. Now, when the glutamic acid with the phosphate attached encounters an ammonia NH3 molecule, the enzyme that does this reaction can make that happen quickly and easily because that reaction releases a significant amount of energy. Enough energy so that the overall change in energy, that's the delta G, that delta G means the change in Gibbs free energy, but it's just a measure of how much energy is gained or lost in a reaction. And now we see that when we combine the reaction with ATP into this mix, instead of requiring 3.4 kilocalories of energy, the process releases 3.9 kilocalories of energy, and that makes the process go. Here's how one of the active transport pumps in our cell membrane works, and I'm not going to talk over this slide. You can pause and look at this. The bottom diagrams show motor proteins walking along a microtubule, and I highly encourage you to take a look at the video that I will share a link to show exactly how this works inside of cells. It's miraculous. It is molecules, but on a molecular level, it looks like there's a little creature walking along a microtubule carrying a vesicle on its back. It really kind of looks like that. So most cells only store a small amount of ATP because it is relatively unstable. Having those three negatively charged phosphates stuck together makes it kind of unstable. And if you want to really dig a little deeper about why ATP is a good energy source, hit me up to talk about this because I'd be happy to share. But it's some chemistry that you're going to need to wrestle with to understand the ideas. Anyway, so we have limited amounts of ATP in our cells, but as we use it up, the cell can immediately regenerate ATP from the ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and the free phosphates that form when ATP is used. So we're constantly using and regenerating ATP in our cells in the cycle that we just looked at. And that regeneration of ATP is more or less the basis for why we breathe. We need oxygen to do that process as efficiently as possible. And we eat to get food molecules that can provide the energy to put those phosphates back on the ADPs to make ATP. That's it.